The morning sun cast long shadows through the blinds of Dr. Maya Washington's home office as she stared at her computer screen, reviewing final notes for her upcoming conference presentation. At 52, she had earned her reputation as one of the most respected appellate court judges in the state, though few would guess her profession from her current appearance. Her usual tailored suits and polished look had been replaced by comfortable jeans and a casual sweater, a choice made necessary by her current predicament. The day had started with the stubborn refusal of her Mercedes to start, despite several attempts. After 15 minutes of frustration, she called her regular mechanic, who promised to look at it later that afternoon. With several important errands to run before the legal conference, she had no choice but to adapt her plans. "No worries," she muttered to herself, ordering a rideshare on her phone. Sometimes the best days start with a little chaos. She gathered her presentation materials into her leather briefcase, a cherished gift from her late father when she'd first been appointed to the bench. Across town, Judge Richard Harrison sat in his chambers, surrounded by the morning's case files. At 48, he prided himself on running the most efficient courtroom in the district. His colleagues often joked that he could process more cases before lunch than most judges handled in a full day. The polished nameplate on his desk gleamed in the fluorescent light as he methodically worked through the stack of traffic citations. Another morning of people trying to talk their way out of tickets, he sighed, straightening his bow tie, his signature accessory that had earned him the nickname the professor among the courthouse staff. He glanced at his watch, noting he had exactly 43 minutes before traffic court began. Meanwhile, Dr. Washington's rideshare driver, a chatty college student named Marcus, filled the journey with stories about his pre-law studies. She smiled, remembering her own days as an eager law student, but kept her current position to herself. The car rolled to a stop outside the bank, her first errand of the day. "Good luck with your studies," she offered warmly as she stepped out. "The legal profession needs bright minds." Inside the bank, she quickly handled her business, but the line had been longer than expected. Checking her phone, she realized she was running behind schedule. She still needed to stop by the courthouse to address a minor traffic matter before heading to the conference. Her phone buzzed with a message from her colleague on the appellate panel, reminding her about their pre-conference meeting. "Everything's fine," she reassured herself, though her carefully planned schedule was quickly unraveling. "There's plenty of time." In his chambers, Judge Harrison reviewed the final case file, making neat annotations in the margins. A knock at his door announced the arrival of his clerk, Sarah, with his morning coffee. Black, no sugar, just as he preferred it. "Heavy docket this morning, Your Honor," Sarah noted, placing the coffee on his desk. "The traffic division is particularly full." "Nothing we can't handle efficiently," he replied, checking his reflection in the window and adjusting his bow tie one final time. Justice delayed is justice denied, after all. Neither judge could have predicted how their paths would cross that morning, or how a simple traffic court appearance would challenge their perspectives and change their understanding of justice. As Dr. Washington's rideshare navigated the morning traffic and Judge Harrison prepared to take the bench, the stage was set for an extraordinary lesson in humility, understanding, and the true meaning of judicial wisdom. The marble halls of the courthouse echoed with hurried footsteps as Dr. Maya Washington made her way to traffic courtroom 3B. Her phone displayed several missed calls from the conference organizers, but those would have to wait. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was a simple matter to resolve. A ticket received at an intersection with a partially obscured sign. Inside the courtroom, Judge Harrison maintained his usual brisk pace. His bow tie remained perfectly centered as he moved through case after case with methodical precision. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows cast dramatic shadows across his bench, adding gravity to each pronouncement. "Next case," he called out, barely glancing up from his papers. Dr. Washington stepped forward, her casual attire standing out among the suits and formal wear that typically filled the courtroom. She carried herself with natural dignity, though her usual judicial presence was softened by the circumstances of her mourning. Your Honor, she began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone well-versed in courtroom procedure. I'd like to explain the circumstances of this citation. Judge Harrison looked up briefly, his eyes scanning her appearance before returning to the citation in front of him. The officer's report indicates you failed to come to a complete stop at the intersection of Maple and 4th. Yes, Your Honor, but the stop sign was partially concealed by overgrown branches, and the morning sun created a significant glare. I have photographs that show. Ms. Washington, Judge Harrison interrupted, emphasizing the Ms. with subtle condescension. I've heard every excuse about hidden signs and sun glare. The fact remains that local residents know this is a controlled intersection. The gallery of waiting defendants watched with interest as Dr. Washington maintained her composure. Your Honor, if I may continue. I see no need for further discussion, Judge Harrison declared, shuffling his papers. The citation stands. That will be a fine of $275, payable to the clerk's office by the end of the month. A slight murmur rippled through the courtroom. Dr. Washington opened her briefcase, intending to present the photographic evidence she'd gathered, but Judge Harrison had already moved on. Next case, he called out, his tone making it clear that the matter was closed. Dr. Washington gathered her belongings, her expression thoughtful rather than angry, as she turned to leave Sarah. The clerk who had brought Judge Harrison's coffee earlier caught her eye with an apologetic look. Something in Dr. Washington's dignified bearing made Sarah wonder if there was more to this particular defendant than met the eye. Outside the courtroom, Dr. Washington checked her watch. The conference would begin in less than an hour, and she still needed to change into her robes and review her notes for the afternoon session. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the conference organizers asking about her arrival time. Well, she mused to herself, this will certainly add an interesting dimension to today's proceedings. Back in the courtroom, Judge Harrison continued his efficient processing of cases, unaware that his next professional obligation would bring him face to face with the woman he had just dismissed so summarily. As he wrapped up the morning session, his clerk approached with a reminder about the afternoon's appellate hearing. Your case is scheduled for 2 p.m. sharp, Your Honor, Sarah informed him. The panel today is particularly distinguished. Judge Harrison nodded, confident in his preparation and unaware that his morning's actions were about to teach him one of the most important lessons of his career. As he gathered his materials for the afternoon session, the wheels of justice and irony continued to turn. The city center's grand ballroom had been transformed into an impressive makeshift courtroom for the afternoon's appellate proceedings. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the rich mahogany panels as legal professionals filtered in, their quiet conversations creating a gentle hum throughout the space. Judge Harrison strode through the entrance, his confidence evident in every step. His bow tie, freshly adjusted after lunch, matched perfectly with his best court attire. Several colleagues nodded in greeting as he made his way toward the front rows, where his carefully prepared notes awaited in his leather briefcase. Richard, called out Judge Michael Chen, a longtime colleague. Ready for your big moment. I heard the panel today is exceptionally thorough. Thoroughly prepared, as always, Harrison replied with a self-assured smile, patting his briefcase. 6 months of work on this case. Every precedent checked and double-checked. The bailiff appeared at the side door, signaling 5 minutes until the session would begin. Harrison took his seat, spreading his materials across the polished table. He'd argued before appellate panels dozens of times, but this case felt different. A chance to establish a precedent that could influence decisions across the state. A door opened behind the raised platform at the front of the room, and the first 2 appellate judges emerged in their formal robes. Harrison recognized them immediately, Judge Roberts and Judge Klein, both known for their sharp questioning and attention to detail. All rise, the bailiff announced, his voice carrying through the now hushed room. Judge Harrison stood with the others, straightening his jacket. The door opened one final time, and his breath caught in his throat. Walking to the center position on the panel, now dressed in the distinguished robes of an appellate court judge, was Dr. Maya Washington. The very same woman he had dismissed so curtly just hours before. Harrison's perfectly prepared opening suddenly felt very far away. He watched, momentarily frozen, as Dr. Washington took her seat with graceful authority. Her transformation from the casual attire of the morning to the full regalia of her true position was striking. The natural dignity he had glimpsed earlier now made perfect sense. "Please be seated," she announced, her voice carrying the same measured tone she had attempted to use in his courtroom. "We're here today to hear arguments in the case of Sterling versus State Banking Commission." Harrison sank into his chair, his collar suddenly feeling uncomfortably tight despite his perfectly knotted bow tie. Several colleagues shot him curious glances, noting his uncharacteristically pale complexion. Dr. Washington began reviewing the preliminary matters, showing no sign that she recognized him from their earlier encounter. But Harrison noticed something in her eyes, not anger or vindictiveness, but a quiet wisdom that made him question every assumption he'd made that morning. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. Judge Chen, noticing his friend's discomfort, leaned over with concern. "Are you all right, Richard? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," Harrison whispered back, his voice barely audible. "Just my own prejudices coming back to teach me a lesson." As Dr. Washington continued with the opening procedures, Harrison found himself doing something he rarely did in court, praying. Not for a favorable decision, but for the wisdom to learn from what was quickly becoming the most humbling moment of his professional life. The afternoon session progressed with the practiced rhythm of high-level legal proceedings, but beneath the formal exterior, subtle currents of tension electrified the air. Dr. Washington commanded the panel with exceptional grace, her questions to the initial presenters demonstrating both precision and insight. From his seat at the counsel table, Judge Harrison found himself studying her judicial presence with new eyes. The way she leaned forward slightly when considering a complex point, her thoughtful pauses before asking follow-up questions, the careful attention she paid to each response, all reflected years of expertise he had completely overlooked that morning. "Judge Harrison," Dr. Washington's voice cut through his thoughts, "we're ready for your arguments on the Sterling case." Rising on slightly unsteady legs, Harrison approached the podium. The familiar weight of his case files offered little comfort as he arranged them before him. In the gallery, Judge Chen watched with growing curiosity. He had never seen his typically confident colleague so unsettled. "Your Honors," Harrison began, his voice initially wavering before finding its usual strength. "The case before us today presents a unique question of banking regulations." As he spoke, Dr. Washington listened intently, her expression neutral and professional. When she raised her hand to ask her first question, Harrison braced himself, expecting perhaps a hint of retribution for his earlier behavior. "Judge Harrison," she began, her tone measured and precise, "your ruling seems to rely heavily on the Williams precedent from 2018. Could you elaborate on how that case's circumstances parallel our current situation?" The question was perfectly fair, insightful even, focusing solely on the legal merits of the case. Harrison felt a mix of relief and shame as he responded, knowing he had shown far less professional courtesy during their earlier encounter. Around the room, other judges and attorneys followed the exchange with interest. Judge Roberts, sitting to Dr. Washington's right, nodded approvingly at the thorough analysis taking place. Judge Klein took detailed notes, clearly impressed by the depth of the discussion. And regarding the matter of public interest, Dr. Washington continued, "How do you reconcile your interpretation with the recent amendments to Section 47? Harrison paused, suddenly seeing a flaw in his original ruling that he had overlooked. The morning's events had shaken his usual certainty, allowing him to view his own work more critically. "Your Honor, upon further reflection, I must acknowledge that aspect deserves additional consideration." A subtle murmur rippled through the audience. Judge Harrison rarely conceded points so readily. Dr. Washington's expression remained neutral, but her eyes reflected a quiet appreciation for his honesty. As the session continued, Harrison found himself responding to questions with increasing humility and thoughtfulness. His typically rapid-fire defensive style gave way to more measured, considered responses. Several colleagues exchanged glances, noticing the unusual shift in his demeanor. When the arguments concluded, Dr. Washington thanked all parties with genuine professional courtesy. "The panel will take these arguments under advisement," she announced. "We will issue our opinion within 30 days." As the session adjourned, Harrison gathered his materials slowly, aware that this afternoon had changed something fundamental in his approach to the law. Judge Chen approached, concern evident on his face. "Richard, I've never seen you like this. What happened in there?" Harrison watched as Dr. Washington conferred quietly with her fellow judges, her natural authority evident in every gesture. "Let's just say," he replied softly, "I received an unexpected lesson in judgment today, and not the kind I usually deliver from the bench." The afternoon sun painted golden stripes across the grand ballroom as the Sterling case continued. Dr. Washington's methodical examination of the legal precedents had captured everyone's attention, transforming what could have been a routine banking regulation case into a masterclass in judicial analysis. "Let's examine the impact on small business owners," she suggested, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. Her question sparked a series of thoughtful exchanges that revealed layers of complexity Harrison hadn't previously considered. As she spoke, he found himself taking notes, not for his defense, but for his own enlightenment. Judge Roberts leaned forward, building on Dr. Washington's line of questioning. "Judge Harrison, how would your interpretation affect family-owned businesses specifically?" Before Harrison could respond, Dr. Washington added a gentle but profound observation. "Perhaps we should consider the perspective of those who might find traditional banking relationships challenging." The subtle reference to their morning encounter wasn't lost on Harrison, though no one else could have caught its significance. In the gallery, Sarah, Harrison's clerk from the morning session, watched with growing fascination. She had slipped into the back of the room out of curiosity, having noticed her boss's unusual demeanor after traffic court. Now, seeing Dr. Washington in her true element, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. "Your Honor," Harrison responded, his voice carrying a new note of reflection, "I believe I may have taken too narrow a view in my original ruling." A few eyebrows raised among the spectators. Judge Harrison was known for defending his positions vigorously, not admitting potential oversights. Dr. Washington nodded appreciatively. "Thank you for that candid assessment. Now, regarding the community impact studies mentioned in your brief." As she methodically worked through each point, Harrison found himself seeing his own work through new eyes. The precedents he had so confidently cited that morning seemed less certain, the conclusions he had drawn less absolute. Each of Dr. Washington's questions revealed another angle he hadn't fully explored. Judge Klein, the third panel member, exchanged an impressed glance with Judge Roberts. They had both served with Dr. Washington before and knew her reputation for thorough analysis. But today she seemed to be operating on an entirely different level, drawing out nuances that even they hadn't considered. "One final question," Dr. Washington announced, adjusting her reading glasses. "In your experience on the bench, Judge Harrison, how often have you found that first impressions in a case needed to be revised upon deeper examination?" The question hung in the air, its deeper meaning clear only to the two of them. Harrison felt the weight of every hasty judgment he had ever made pressing down on his shoulders. "More often than I previously cared to admit, Your Honor," he replied, his voice carrying the humility that surprised even his closest colleagues. Dr. Washington closed her notepad with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Judge Harrison. Your candor is appreciated." She turned to address the entire room. "I believe this case has revealed several important principles about careful consideration and the value of looking beyond surface appearances." As the session drew to a close, the gathered legal professionals buzzed with discussion about the unexpected turns the arguments had taken. But Harrison barely noticed, his mind already reviewing years of decisions, wondering how many other times he had failed to look deeper, to listen more carefully, to consider perspectives different from his own. The courthouse cafe sat quiet and nearly empty in the late afternoon light. Most of the day's proceedings had ended, leaving only the gentle clink of coffee cups and murmured conversations. Dr. Washington had chosen this moment carefully, sending a brief note to Judge Harrison requesting his presence. She sat at a corner table, her judicial robes now draped over the back of her chair, a steaming cup of tea before her. The formal barriers of the courtroom had been set aside, though the weight of their earlier encounters still hung in the air. Harrison approached the table, his usual confident stride replaced by something more measured. "Dr. Washington," he began, his hand unconsciously adjusting his bow tie. "I appreciate you taking the time. Please, call me Maya," she smiled, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I think we've moved past formalities today." She pushed a cup of coffee toward him. Black, no sugar, just as his clerk had brought him that morning. Harrison settled into the chair, noticing the thoughtful gesture. "You spoke with Sarah." "Your clerk?" "Yes. She's very observant." Dr. Washington took a sip of her tea, rather like that young traffic court judge I met this morning. Observant, but perhaps not seeing the whole picture. The gentle prod carried no malice, and Harrison found himself relaxing slightly. "I deserve that. More than that, actually." "This isn't about what anyone deserves, Richard," she replied, using his first name deliberately. "It's about what we can learn from each other." Through the cafe window, they could see the courthouse square where people from all walks of life crossed paths. Lawyers in suits, families in casual wear, courthouse staff heading home for the day. Dr. Washington watched them for a moment before continuing. "You know, my father was a judge too," she shared, her voice warm with memory. "He used to say that the hardest cases weren't about interpreting the law. They were about understanding people." Harrison nodded, thinking of his own journey to the bench. "I've always prided myself on running an efficient courtroom. Today made me wonder what I might have missed in that efficiency." "Efficiency has its place," Dr. Washington acknowledged. "But so does patience, so does listening. Each person who enters our courtroom carries their own story, their own struggles, their own dignity." A gentle breeze through the open cafe door carried the scent of blooming jasmine from the courthouse garden. Harrison found himself sharing stories from his early days as a public defender, memories he hadn't revisited in years. Dr. Washington listened intently, occasionally offering her own experiences, both the triumphs and the challenges. Their conversation flowed naturally, touching on their shared passion for justice, their different perspectives, and their hopes for the legal system. "You know," Harrison said finally, "I sat through countless seminars on judicial temperament and implicit bias. None of them taught me what I learned in one day with you." Dr. Washington's eyes crinkled with warmth. "The best lessons often come from unexpected places, or unexpected traffic court appearances," she added with a gentle laugh. As the cafe's closing time approached, they gathered their things, both feeling the shift in their professional relationship. What had started as a tense encounter had transformed into something valuable, a bridge of understanding between two different perspectives on justice. "Thank you," Harrison said simply as they prepared to leave, "not just for this conversation, but for handling today with such grace." "We're all learning, Richard," Dr. Washington replied. "The key is to keep our minds and hearts open to the lessons." 3 months after his transformative encounter with Dr. Washington, Judge Harrison's courtroom 3B had undergone a subtle but significant transformation. The physical space remained the same. Tall windows still cast morning light across the polished wooden benches, and the American flag still stood proudly beside his chair, but the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Sarah, his trusted clerk, was the first to notice the changes. The morning docket still moved efficiently, but there was a new rhythm to the proceedings. Harrison had started arriving 15 minutes earlier each day, taking time to review not just the charges, but the circumstances surrounding each case. "Your Honor," a young woman spoke from the podium one morning, her voice trembling slightly as she explained her parking violation. "I know I parked in a restricted zone, but my daughter was having an asthma attack, and the pharmacy was closing." The old Judge Harrison might have cut her off, citing rules and regulations. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his bow tie as neat as ever, but his expression softer. "Please continue," he encouraged. "Tell me more about what happened that evening." In the gallery, a young law student observing court proceedings scribbled notes frantically. This wasn't the stern, unyielding Judge Harrison she'd been warned about by her seniors at the law firm. During a brief recess, Judge Chen stopped by, curious about the changes he'd been hearing about. He found Harrison in his chambers, reviewing case files with a new perspective. "I hear you're developing quite a reputation," Chen remarked, settling into a chair. "They're saying you've become the most thoughtful judge on the circuit." Harrison smiled, adjusting a framed photo on his desk. A new edition showing him and Dr. Washington speaking at a recent judicial conference. "I'm just trying to see the whole picture now, not just the parts that fit my preconceptions." His calendar had expanded to include regular community outreach programs. Once a month, he spoke at local schools about the justice system, emphasizing the importance of understanding and fairness. His presentations always included the story of a wise appellate judge who had taught him about looking beyond first impressions. Even his sentencing practices had evolved. While he maintained appropriate consequences for violations, he now took time to explain his decisions, ensuring that everyone in his courtroom understood not just the what, but the why of justice. One afternoon, as summer turned to fall, Sarah brought in a letter that made him pause. The defendant from 6 months ago had written to thank him, not for dismissing her case, which he hadn't, but for listening, for understanding, for treating her with dignity, even as he upheld the law. "Things are taking a bit longer these days," Harrison admitted to Sarah as he finished his afternoon docket. "But I think we're doing better justice." Sarah nodded, remembering the day Dr. Washington had appeared in traffic court. "The extra time seems worth it, Your Honor. People leave your courtroom different now, even when they don't get the outcome they hoped for." As Harrison gathered his materials for the day, he glanced at the judicial oath framed on his wall. The words "equal justice under law" caught the late afternoon sun, reminding him of his conversation with Dr. Washington in the courthouse cafe. "You know, Sarah," he said thoughtfully, "sometimes the most important journey in a courtroom isn't from innocent to guilty or guilty to innocent. Sometimes it's the journey from judgment to understanding." 1 year later, the grand ballroom of the State Judicial Conference buzzed with anticipation. Judges from across the state had gathered for the annual keynote address, but this year was different. Instead of a single speaker, 2 judges would share the stage: Dr. Maya Washington and Judge Richard Harrison. The room had reached capacity, with young law clerks and veteran judges alike crowded together. Sarah, now Harrison's senior clerk, sat in the front row beside Judge Chen, both proud witnesses to the transformation they'd observed over the past year. Dr. Washington took the podium first, her presence as commanding as ever. "Justice," she began, "is not just about knowing the law. It's about understanding the people the law serves." Her eyes met Harrison's as he sat nearby, his signature bow tie perfectly straight, a warm smile on his face. "Today," she continued, "Judge Harrison, and I want to share a story about perspective, about growth, and about the daily opportunities we have to learn from each other." Harrison joined her at the podium, their easy rapport evident to everyone in the room. "Dr. Washington and I had an interesting first meeting," he began, drawing knowing chuckles from those who'd heard whispers of their story. "I was, shall we say, rather quick to judgment that day." As they took turns sharing their experience, the audience leaned forward, captivated. Young judges scribbled notes, while more seasoned ones nodded in recognition of their own similar moments. "The beauty of our profession," Dr. Washington explained, "is that every day presents us with chances to see beyond our initial impressions. Every person who enters our courtroom carries a story worthy of being heard." Harrison added, "I used to measure my success by how quickly I could clear my docket. Now I measure it by how well I listen, how deeply I understand, and how fairly I can apply the law while respecting the dignity of everyone in my courtroom." Their presentation included practical tips for creating more inclusive courtrooms, but it was their personal story that resonated most deeply. They showed how a potentially antagonistic moment had transformed into an opportunity for growth and understanding. In the audience, a first-year law student raised her hand during the question period. "Weren't you worried about losing authority by admitting your mistake, Judge Harrison?" Harrison smiled, adjusting his bow tie thoughtfully. "True authority," he replied, "comes not from being infallible, but from being willing to learn and grow. The strongest judges I know are those who remain students of justice their entire careers." Dr. Washington nodded in agreement. "We're not just interpreting laws," she added. "We're helping to build trust in the justice system, one interaction at a time." As the session concluded, the applause was warm and genuine. Judges lingered afterward, sharing their own stories of lessons learned and perspectives changed. The presentation had sparked a movement within the state's judicial system, leading to new training programs and mentorship opportunities. Later, as they gathered their materials, Dr. Washington turned to Harrison. "Who would have thought that a simple traffic ticket would lead to all this?" Harrison chuckled. "Life's greatest lessons often come disguised as our most humbling moments." He paused, then added sincerely, "Thank you for teaching me not just to judge, but to understand." Together, they had transformed a moment of potential conflict into a lasting legacy of positive change in their judicial system. Their story would be shared in judicial training sessions for years to come, a reminder that true justice requires not just knowledge of the law, but wisdom of the heart.